Hello, everybody in YouTube land. So I haven't done a video in quite a while now, so thought I would come on today and talk about a couple things. And I want to talk today about the two ingredients that you need to succeed in real estate. Now, I feel the need to make this video since, the past few months. Probably you've seen this as well. My inbox and especially my social media feeds, they're literally just peppered with these ads from these syndicators due to affordable, housing projects like, generate wealth in affordable housing. I mean, I've seen even a few of these in Kelowna. One of these ads in particular said, buy a $50 million project, big apartment complex for only 2.5 million. I had a lot of these on social media too. I actually responded to a couple of them, and it's just bonkers. It's just bananas. So I just want to talk about this. With 5% down, high leverage. Most of this is MLI Select. So I'm going to talk about what the two ingredients for success, basically in my estimation. Now I've been doing this for 25 years. I think I know what I'm doing at this point. And just what I've been seeing going on this year is just bananas. So I'm just going to take a step back, and just talk about a few things kind of from my perspective and, what I feel are some of the risks, real risks going forward in a market now where, Canadian real estate's not a slam dunk anymore. You don't just buy something and it's just going to go up and up like crazy, like it used to be. And, you'll be fine. So there's a lot more you need to consider today as a real estate investor, especially as a new real estate investor. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So first of all, having said, those ads just, peppering my inbox and social feed, I'm going to start with a story. So there was a real estate agent named Ed. So this was about probably 20 years ago, when, back in my early days. We were involved in these networking groups in Edmonton. And so the title of this guy's pitch was basically, how to double your money in real estate, even in a down market. So I thought, okay, well, I'm pretty new. Let's hear what this guy has to say. So basically, he came out on there. It was a very small group. There was maybe 15 people there. And what he said was, so here's what you do. You buy with 25% down and you just over 20 years you pay off the mortgage. So you don't owe anything, right? So you paid it all down. So even if the value drops by 50%, you're still going to double your money. And for example, it's $100,000 property, you put 25,000 down. At the end of the day, the end of 20 years, it's only worth 50. You still doubled your 25, right? So, the room, I think they were looking for a magic bullet. They kind of just looked at the guy, gave him some funny looks, and, he lost the room after that. He went on, he tried to finish his spiel, but the room, they weren't very nice to him. But, I thought about what he said, and it's very accurate, like he's basically taking the concept of mortgage paydown, which is basically the number one ingredient. So the number one ingredient to success that I want to talk about today is mortgage paydown. Now, this is something that has just almost been completely omitted or forgotten, especially in the last, couple of years. Since I want to say, around June of 2022, with the introduction of CMHC's MLI Select program. Now, if you're not familiar with this program, it enables you to buy commercial assets, 5 units or more, with as little as 5% down, 95% financing, very low, very skinny cash flow. You only need, 10%, 1.1 debt cover over your payments to qualify. So you can qualify for massive debt with very low money down. So this is the purpose of the government, with a caveat of you have to keep your rents low, for affordable housing. So, almost all investors I know have just dove headfirst into this. And the whole concept of mortgage paydown now has just been thrown out the window. Nobody's even talking about this anymore, which for me, this is just bonkers. Because when I did my syndications, when I started doing apartment buildings back in 2005, I did my first JV about 5 years later. One of the things I told my money partners was like, look, if this market is flat and we're not going to earn, a single dime in appreciation or cash flow, based on what our down payment was and how much we're going to pay down our debt over that 5 year term, I'm pretty confident, very confident we can generate at least a 30% return. Because even if the market's flat, we're still going to owe only this much after our term. So even if we had to sell it for the same as what we paid, there's still a nice chunk in it for you. Today with these products, it's gone. There's no equity pay down. They're essentially interest only mortgages. So you have the risk at your 5-year term of not only not getting your mortgage renewed, but of having to pay down equity. And, this is happening more and more. Now, I'm not just going to pick on MLS Select. There's also, creative products. I've seen a lot of these agreement for sales, vendor take back mortgages. These strategies are great to bridge to get you to the point where you want to get a term mortgage. But you can't have an agreement for sale or a vendor take mortgage for 10 years, 20 years. Very few exceptions to that. It usually doesn't work. Usually it's only a conduit to get you to, the end of the mortgage so you can, term it out afterwards. So you got to be really careful doing those strategies too. The only real time, there's only one time I would ever consider doing high leverage, and it's a very short term if I can get the rents up really high in a short period of time. And I've done that, Burr method a few times, but it's definitely the exception and not the rule. So that's something to strongly consider. You really want to get the pay down because you need that. There's real risks in doing these other strategies. Now, I'm not saying they're all bad. I'm just saying that, the tried and true method is mortgage pay down. So you absolutely have to have that as part of your long-term strategy. So you're not going to, buy a real estate investment and, manage it for 20 years with having no pay down. I know the argument of, debt becomes cheaper over time due to inflation, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's certainly true. But you need to have a comfortable amount of leverage to equity in there at all times. And you always have to have a pay down component. There's just too much risk at the end of your term to not have that equity piece at the end. So what's the right amount? Uh, for me, I tend to have about 65 to 70, maybe 75 loan to value long term. Now, debt to equity is kind of in the eye of the beholder. You say, well, I have $1 million debt and I think my property is worth 1.5, but you don't really know until you've sold it, right? So it's more of an estimation at this point, but you got to have a comfortable, cash flow cushion. And I'm going to talk all about cash flow in another video. So this one is just strictly on the two ingredients you need today for sure. So MLI Select, good program for, new construction, certain types of investments for sure. But you have to have a conversation about mortgage pay down. Like you cannot survive as an investor without it. Period. I can't state that enough. And I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but that's strongly, how I feel about it. So the second piece is cash reserves. So going hand in hand with the first, I'm going to use that first example, buy a $50 million project, only 2.5 million down, 5%. Well, malarkey to that, right? Because you still have to have closing costs, which I'm not even going to get into in this video, plus a large cash reserve. So especially on older, multifamily or older projects, you're going to have turnover. You're going to have improvements. You're going to have to do renovate units. You're going to have to do capital improvements if you've had the asset long enough. Your roof, your boiler system, your decks, your parking lot, landscaping, common areas, whatever it may be. Even most seasoned investors I know have been bit with this. And most people, when they're going in, they either don't have enough of a sufficient reserve fund or none at all. And I was kind of like that at the beginning. I was scraping together my cash just enough to get that 25% down to get that project. But you know what? It creates a lot of stress in your life. If you have a couple bad months where you turn over 3 units, you're vacant, and now all of a sudden, you have to, send your property manager a check for 20 grand or 20, 30 grand, right? And how often can you do that, right? And how often do you really want to do that? So my recommendation on that is, you want to have probably at least 5 to 7.5% of the asset purchase price in a cash reserve. And I can hear people saying, well, that's not going to earn interest and blah, blah, blah. Well, trust me, you're going to need that. Include that as part of your ROI. So, in summary, those two things that you need the most. Okay. So you have to have mortgage pay down and you have to have a large cash reserve. And in these large syndications, like literally on my Instagram, I probably can scroll through 10 of them at any given time. And the questions you really need to ask of these guys ladies or whoever's running these syndications is what's your plan? What's your debt level going to be at the end of your mortgage term? What is your plan? How are you going to do that? And what's your cash reserves? How much cash reserve do you have? Is it, 1%, 2%? Besides fees, fees is something else altogether. But if they don't have a sufficient cash reserve and they don't have mortgage pay down, it's probably not going to be a good deal. And you also want to get a track record of their success in that similar type of asset with that similar type of financing. So the thing that is completely omitted with these affordable, really high return, low money down affordable projects, it's the fact that they're not worth the shit because people won't buy them. People won't assume the mortgages if they can't raise the rents, if they're crippled by these restrictions on being able to raise the rent, hence raising value. Case in point, I've probably run into at least 5 larger deals, 50 units plus, sometimes 100 units plus. And I'm wondering, why are these things still for sale? And then I look, they either have the MLI Select, they used it for construction, they got it up and going, and now they're trying to sell it, without the new owner being able to raise rents, and they're asking obviously high values, or CMHC's Flex program, which was the program before MLI Select. So, these affordable mortgages or the caveats that are with CMHC are really a detriment to your asset value. Huge so. Like I've seen some of these projects that are discounted up to 30% just because of the debt that's attached to it. If you think of just how Coco Loco that is. So that's another reason not to do it. Now, I'm not saying don't ever consider doing MLI Select or 5% down, but I think you really need a very clear long-term strategy. You need to have at least 10, plan to have it for 10 years. Don't sell it before 10 years. So some of these, pro formas I've seen from some of these syndicators, well, we're going to make all this money in this period of time, but, they've never sold a project. MLI Select has only been around for 2 years. But I don't think very few people who have opted into CMHC have sold their projects. And so anybody who's doing that, you'll want to see a record of sales. How did this pan out at the end? How did you get out of this select? Well, you can't because that's on the title. You can't, get rid of that financing. So there's really a lot to consider. So if you're buying in any rental property, commercial multifamily, you need those two components. You need mortgage pay down and you need a large cash reserve. If you go by that rule of thumb, 25% down, 20-year, 25-year amortization over a 5-year term, and you have sufficient cash reserves, 5 to 7.5%, even if provided you didn't buy in like a really bad area, you're probably going to be okay. Your chances of success, if you hold that asset for 10 years or more, are very high. Obviously 20 years is even better. Your chance of success are even higher. You're going to pay that mortgage down a lot, and you're really going to start to reap the benefits towards the later half of that mortgage. You try to go 5 years or less, it gets a little dicier, gets a little riskier, especially if you try to go 1 year, whether you're doing a flip, whether you're doing a burr, trying to get your value up quickly. Have done quite a few of those successfully, but like I said, again, they're the exception and not the rule. Your chances of reward, yeah, you can double your money, quickly. Your chances of reward are good, but so are your risks. In an ever-changing environment, short, you're always going to leave yourself exposed to changing market forces whenever you go short like that. So in summary, I hope this gives you some context and, ask the right questions when you're getting into these deals or if you're going to do them yourself. My next video is going to be on cash flow. So I'm going to talk all about basically the cash flow myth of Canadian real estate investing, because, we've seen this bull run of, 20 plus years in Canada. And a lot of investors today have never really seen a downturn until now. And, the final curtain call, you can say, of what's going to happen in the next couple of years is yet to happen. So these markets go in cycles, but we're at the very end of a very, very long bull run. So my next video is going to be all about cash flow and what it actually is and what you need to look at. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you like the blog. Continue to follow me, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video, and happy investing.